Albert Fish, often referred to as the Gray Man, or the Brooklyn Vampire, occupies one of the darkest corners of American criminal history. His crimes, committed during the early 20th century, were both shocking and horrifying, leaving a lasting imprint on law enforcement, psychology, and public consciousness. Unlike more recent criminals whose acts unfolded in the age of instant media coverage, Fish's crimes emerged in a period when newspapers, local authorities, and community networks were the primary conduits of information. Despite the distance of decades, his story continues to fascinate scholars, psychologists, and those interested in the extremes of human behavior, not for the purpose of sensationalism, but to understand the complex interplay of trauma, mental illness, and societal response. Before diving into the story, I want to invite you to subscribe, like, and comment. Let me know where you're listening from and who you'd like me to cover next. Your engagement helps build a community of people who are curious about history, psychology, and the stories that shape our understanding of human behavior. Every comment and subscription allows me to continue creating detailed, research explorations of infamous figures and the social contexts around them. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His early life was marked by hardship, neglect, and exposure to trauma, factors that researchers have often cited when trying to understand his later criminal behavior. He lost his father at a young age, and his mother, struggling to provide care, placed him in an orphanage for a period of his childhood. Fish's experiences there were far from nurturing. The environment was harsh, and children were often subjected to strict discipline and minimal emotional support. Historians and psychologists analyzing Fish's early years point to these formative experiences as laying the groundwork for the unusual and disturbing patterns that would emerge later in his life. Even as a child, Fish exhibited unusual behaviors that alarmed those around him. Accounts from his early years describe him as withdrawn, solitary, and prone to compulsive actions. While he showed some ability to engage with normal social interactions, these moments were interspersed with increasingly bizarre and alarming behavior, which some modern psychologists interpret as early signs of emerging psychopathology. It is essential to acknowledge, however, that while childhood trauma can correlate with later criminal behavior, it does not predetermine it. Fish's trajectory represents a particularly extreme and tragic intersection of early trauma, mental illness, and personal choice. As he transitioned into adolescence and adulthood, Fish's behaviors grew more disturbing. He moved to New York City, where he lived in poverty and attempted various forms of employment. Accounts indicate that he was socially isolated, living on the margins of society, and increasingly consumed by compulsions and fantasies that would later manifest in violent ways. During this period, he began to develop his complex sexual pathology, characterized by sadism and masochism. Fish's early adult life illustrates a pattern seen in many criminal cases: isolation, obsession, and the gradual escalation of compulsive behavior, which, without intervention, can evolve into criminal acts. Fish married and had children, which provided a temporary veneer of normalcy. Yet behind this facade, his compulsions persisted and intensified. Researchers note that many individuals who commit serious crimes often maintain outward appearances of ordinary life while engaging in deeply disturbing private behaviors. Fish's ability to mask his pathology allowed him to evade early detection, illustrating the complex interplay between outward social conformity and internal deviance. It also underscores the challenges faced by law enforcement and mental health professionals in identifying potential threats before tragic events occur. By the 1920s and 1930s, Fish's criminal behavior had escalated. He began targeting children, luring them with promises or gifts, and engaging in acts of extreme cruelty. While the specifics of these acts are documented in historical records, it is critical to approach the subject with sensitivity, especially when considering the families affected. Modern analyses focus not on salacious details but on the patterns of criminal behavior, the psychological underpinnings, and the societal failures that allowed him to continue unchecked for many years. Fish's crimes shocked communities, prompted increased public awareness, and eventually mobilized law enforcement agencies to develop more sophisticated investigative strategies for dealing with child abduction and murder. Fish's methods and compulsion were influenced by a combination of factors, including his mental illness, sadomasochistic tendencies, and a distorted understanding of morality and religion. He often justified his actions through a warped lens of religious devotion, which modern psychologists interpret as a sign of severe psychosis. Fish claimed that he believed his actions were spiritually sanctioned or necessary, demonstrating a profound detachment from societal norms and a dangerous internal logic that permitted extreme violence. This intersection of mental illness and criminal behavior presents challenging questions for both legal systems and mental health professionals. How to balance accountability, understanding, and the need to protect society from future harm. Despite the severity of his actions, Fish evaded capture for decades, illustrating the limitations of early 20th century investigative techniques. Law enforcement relied on community tips, basic forensics, and local intelligence networks. Fish's unassuming appearance and seemingly ordinary life allowed him to blend in, making detection difficult. His eventual capture in the early 1930s came as a result of careful investigative work, including the collaboration between police officers, local citizens, and emerging forensic techniques. The resolution of his case demonstrated both the persistence required in complex criminal investigations and the importance of community involvement in public safety. The trial of Albert Fish was a landmark event, drawing national attention and sparking debates about criminal responsibility and mental health. Fish pleaded guilty, but his defense argued that he was insane, unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of his crimes. Psychiatrists examined him extensively, documenting severe psychosis, sadomasochism, and paraphilic disorders. The legal proceedings balanced public demand for justice with the need for a thorough psychiatric evaluation, highlighting the evolving relationship between the legal system and mental health understanding. Fish's case became a reference point in discussions about the insanity defense and the treatment of mentally ill offenders, influencing both legislation and public perception in subsequent decades. During his imprisonment on death row, Fish remained a subject of psychological study, media attention, and public fascination. Experts documented his behavior, letters, and confessions to better understand the mind of someone capable of extreme violence. Researchers used his case to explore issues of compulsion, paraphilic disorders, and psychotic delusions, contributing to the emerging field of criminal psychology. While Fish was ultimately executed in 1936, the data and insights derived from his behavior have continued to inform both criminal profiling and mental health treatment strategies. His life and actions, while deeply tragic, offered valuable lessons to psychologists and law enforcement about the warning signs of extreme deviance and the importance of early intervention. It is important to remember that Albert Fish's story is not just about the individual, it is also about societal context. His actions exposed gaps in child protection, law enforcement protocols, and mental health services. Communities, police departments, and policymakers were forced to confront the limitations of existing systems and consider reforms to prevent similar tragedies. The case highlights the broader social responsibility to safeguard vulnerable populations and the ongoing challenge of balancing civil liberties, privacy, and public safety. Fish's crimes, horrific as they were, prompted developments in investigative methodology, child welfare policy, and psychiatric evaluation that have had lasting impact on American society. Even decades later, Fish's name remains associated with cautionary discussions about extreme criminal behavior. Historians, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals continue to study his life to understand the convergence of mental illness, trauma, and deviant behavior. Books, documentaries, and academic papers examine both his crimes and the systemic failures that allowed them to persist. These analyses focus not on sensationalizing violence but on comprehending its origins, patterns, and consequences. By doing so, they aim to inform contemporary discussions about prevention, intervention, and public awareness. Albert Fish's story also underscores the enduring importance of historical context. Crimes committed in the early 20th century occurred in a society with limited mental health infrastructure, rudimentary forensic tools, and less formalized protective services for children. Understanding his actions required. As Albert Fish transitioned into adulthood, the patterns established in his early life of neglect, trauma, and social isolation began to solidify. His personal and social life was largely unremarkable on the surface. He married, had children, and maintained steady employment for periods. Yet beneath this facade of ordinary existence, the compulsions and deviant fantasies that had troubled him since childhood intensified. These early adult years, stretching through the 1890s and into the early 1900s, were marked by a combination of poverty, social marginalization, and emerging criminal impulses, all of which would shape the disturbing trajectory of his later actions. Fish worked a variety of jobs during this period, ranging from labor positions to domestic work. He frequently struggled financially, which compounded his feelings of inadequacy and isolation. These stressors, combined with unresolved psychological issues, contributed to the gradual escalation of his deviant behavior. Reports from acquaintances and family members suggest that he became increasingly withdrawn, preoccupied with his own compulsions, and prone to engaging in activities that would later be recognized as indicators of extreme pathology. It is worth noting that his outwardly mundane life allowed him to blend into the communities he inhabited, making his underlying compulsions harder to detect by those around him. During this period, Fish began to experiment with forms of sexual and sadistic behavior that were early indicators of the acts he would later commit. He reportedly engaged in self-harm and masochistic practices, which he sometimes rationalized through religious devotion. These behaviors were not widely known to those around him, and for decades, he maintained a semblance of normalcy that allowed him to avoid early legal intervention. Modern psychologists often interpret these patterns as manifestations of severe paraphilic disorders, compounded by early life trauma and a profound sense of social isolation. The 1910s and 1920s were particularly formative. Fish moved to various parts of New York City, often living in boarding houses and working menial jobs. His marriage, though functional in a conventional sense, did not provide the emotional support he needed, and his compulsions continued in secrecy. Neighbors and colleagues occasionally noted odd behaviors, such as his fascination with children and strange self-imposed rituals, but there were no overt indications that he would become the infamous criminal history would later record. These years illustrate the way that severe psychological disturbances can exist beneath the surface of an outwardly ordinary life, making early detection and intervention extremely difficult. As Fish entered his 40s, his compulsions began to manifest more aggressively. He started targeting children in small, isolated incidents, often using deception or promises of gifts to lure them into his control. The earliest of these offenses, documented by historians and law enforcement records, suggest a pattern of escalating risk. Initial minor transgressions were followed by more intrusive and dangerous actions. The victims were carefully selected, often chosen for their perceived vulnerability, highlighting Fish's manipulative tendencies and his ability to exploit trust. These acts, though not immediately linked to him at the time, began to attract attention from local authorities and communities as patterns of missing children and suspicious activity emerged. Fish's psychological profile during this period is particularly notable. Experts studying his case note a combination of obsessive-compulsive tendencies, paraphilic disorders, and psychosis. His religious beliefs, warped and extreme, were often intertwined with his compulsions, as he claimed that divine guidance justified certain behaviors. This intertwining of mental illness and moral rationalization created a dangerous internal logic that allowed Fish to pursue increasingly harmful acts without apparent remorse. Contemporary analyses of his behavior suggest that his mind operated under a rigid set of compulsions and delusions, making intervention exceptionally challenging. One of the key aspects of Fish's early adult crimes was his ability to avoid immediate detection. Communities at the time lacked the forensic and investigative resources available to law enforcement today. Missing children, though noticed, were often not linked to a single perpetrator until patterns became unmistakable. Fish's outward appearance as a quiet, harmless man allowed him to maintain proximity to vulnerable individuals without arousing suspicion. This duality, an ordinary exterior masking extreme deviance, remains one of the reasons his case continues to fascinate criminologists and psychologists alike. During this phase, Fish also engaged in behaviors that demonstrated a compulsion for control and secrecy. He meticulously documented his thoughts and actions in diaries, often in cryptic or coded language. While the full contents of these writings were later recovered and analyzed by law enforcement, they offer insight into the mind of an individual whose fantasies and obsessions had become dangerously intertwined. The diaries reveal a person both organized and erratic, capable of careful planning yet driven by compulsive urges that overrode social and moral constraints. These writings are frequently cited in studies of criminal psychology as examples of how compulsive thought patterns can escalate into violent action when unaddressed. The social and familial dynamics of Fish's life also contributed to the trajectory of his offenses. His marriage, while providing a superficial stability, did not address the underlying psychological turmoil he experienced. Reports indicate that he remained emotionally detached, often fixated on private rituals and fantasies. The combination of social isolation, unaddressed mental illness, and compulsion created a perfect storm, allowing him to act on increasingly harmful impulses over decades. Mental health professionals reviewing his history suggest that the absence of intervention, whether familial, medical, or social, played a significant role in the eventual escalation of his crimes. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Fish's behavior had escalated to the point where law enforcement began to recognize a pattern of child abduction and abuse in the areas where he lived. While he had committed earlier offenses, these incidents were now increasingly linked by geographic and temporal proximity. Communities became aware of the danger, and newspapers occasionally reported suspicious incidents, though the connection to Fish himself remained unconfirmed. His ability to continue acting without immediate consequence demonstrates both the limitations of early 20th century investigative resources and the cunning with which he conducted his activities. Fish's eventual identification and apprehension, though still years away in this phase of his life, were the result of meticulous police work combined with public vigilance. Law enforcement would later describe his case as emblematic of the difficulties inherent in tracking offenders who operated in secrecy and who were able to blend seamlessly into ordinary society. The early adult years, therefore, are critical for understanding how Fish's compulsions evolved, how his social environment facilitated his anonymity, and how patterns of early offending laid the groundwork for the crimes that would eventually bring him to public attention. Throughout this period, Fish remained an enigma to those who knew him. Neighbors and acquaintances often described him as polite, quiet, and unassuming, a man whose outward demeanor did not hint at the disturbing fantasies and early offenses that consumed his private life. This duality, ordinary exterior masking dangerous compulsions, is one of the reasons his case continues to be studied in both criminal psychology and law enforcement. Researchers emphasize that early warning signs, though often subtle, were present, and that a better understanding of such behaviors could inform modern strategies for early intervention and protection of vulnerable populations. The historical record of Fish's early adult life provides a clear progression from private compulsion to public offense. His experiences highlight the intersection of trauma, mental illness, social isolation, and opportunity in the development of extreme criminal behavior. By examining the timeline of these years, it becomes evident that the seeds of his most notorious crimes were planted decades before they came to public attention. This understanding allows scholars to analyze not only the individual case but also broader societal and systemic factors that may contribute to the development of violent criminal behavior. Albert Fish's story in these formative adult years serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of social support, mental health intervention, and vigilant communities. His ability to live undetected while escalating toward more serious crimes illustrates the challenges of prevention when early warning signs are ignored or unnoticed. At the same time, studying these years provides critical insight into the psychology of compulsion, the dynamics of secrecy, and the mechanisms by which extreme behavior can emerge over time. As he approached the 1930s, Fish's trajectory pointed inevitably toward the events that would make him infamous in American history. His compulsions, long hidden beneath the veneer of ordinary life, were growing increasingly urgent and dangerous. Communities remained unaware of the full scope of his activities. Law enforcement had yet to connect the emerging patterns, and Fish himself continued. By the early 1930s, Albert Fish's compulsions, which had been building quietly over decades, began to manifest in ways that brought him into direct conflict with law enforcement and the communities he inhabited. These years marked a turning point. The private behaviors of an isolated and troubled man began spilling into public awareness, leading to the first concrete reports of his criminal activity. The pattern of escalating risk, first evident in his earlier adult life, now became increasingly apparent, though Fish's cunning and ability to maintain an ordinary appearance continued to shield him from immediate capture. Fish's activities during this period involved calculated efforts to target vulnerable children. He employed deception, charm, and manipulation to gain access to those he sought, often presenting himself as a benign figure, sometimes under the guise of offering assistance, small gifts, or attention. Historical accounts indicate that his victims were carefully selected, chosen for their isolation or the opportunity Fish perceived to act without interruption. The specifics of his actions are harrowing, and the psychological implications are profound, but it is important to recount them with care, focusing on the progression of his criminal behavior, the investigative challenges it presented, and the societal context that allowed it to continue for years. The first widely documented incident that drew attention to Fish occurred in the early 1930s, when families in New York and surrounding areas reported missing children. These disappearances, though treated individually at first, were linked over time by geographic proximity, timing, and other subtle indicators. At the time, law enforcement resources were limited, and investigative methods were rudimentary compared to modern standards. Detectives relied on witness accounts, basic records, and community reporting, which meant that offenders like Fish, who blended into the social fabric, could evade detection for extended periods. His ability to navigate these early stages of criminal activity without attracting suspicion is a testament to the duality of his life: outwardly ordinary, inwardly consumed by compulsion. Psychologists examining Fish's early crimes note that his behaviors reflect a combination of paraphilic disorder and psychosis, compounded by decades of unaddressed trauma. Fish reportedly rationalized his actions through a warped sense of morality intertwined with religious beliefs, claiming that certain behaviors were divinely sanctioned. While this does not excuse his crimes, it provides insight into his mental state and the internal logic that allowed him to commit acts of extreme violence. Experts often highlight this period of escalation as crucial for understanding the trajectory of offenders whose compulsions evolve unchecked, demonstrating the intersection of psychological pathology and opportunity. During these years, Fish's interaction with potential victims often involved careful planning. He would observe routines, identify times when children were unsupervised, and select locations that offered both opportunity and concealment. The calculated nature of these offenses illustrates his capacity for premeditation, a point that would later be central in both his trial and psychological evaluations. Despite the extreme nature of his impulses, Fish maintained a carefully curated exterior. Neighbors, employers, and family members rarely suspected the depths of his deviance. This ability to maintain dual identities, ordinary citizen by day, predator by compulsion, is a recurring theme in the study of criminal psychology, highlighting the challenges inherent in detecting and intervening in such cases. As Fish continued to act on his compulsions, his behavior grew increasingly risky. Patterns emerged, including the targeting of children from specific neighborhoods and the use of predictable lures. Law enforcement agencies began to notice clusters of missing children and suspicious circumstances, though linking them to a single perpetrator remained difficult. Fish's ability to exploit social trust, combined with the limited investigative tools of the time, allowed him to continue acting for months without immediate consequence. This phase of his life underscores a critical issue: the gap between early warning signs and the ability of authorities to prevent escalation, a challenge still relevant in modern criminal investigations. The psychological profile of Fish during this period is notable for the combination of compulsive behavior, sexual pathology, and delusional thinking. His writings, diaries, and letters, later recovered and analyzed, reveal a mind consumed by obsession, yet capable of meticulous planning and strategic deception. The interplay between his psychosis and compulsions created a dangerous feedback loop. Internal justifications reinforced behavior, which in turn strengthened his delusions and impulses. Scholars studying his case emphasize that this pattern is characteristic of certain extreme offenders, demonstrating how untreated mental illness can facilitate the development of increasingly dangerous behavior over time. While Fish's behavior was increasingly visible in subtle ways, the general public remained largely unaware of the full scope of his activities. Media coverage of missing children and suspected abductions existed, but it lacked the forensic and investigative rigor needed to identify a single perpetrator. Communities were often left with fear, suspicion, and incomplete information. This gap between public awareness and effective law enforcement intervention contributed to the prolonged period during which Fish could continue his crimes without detection. The social dynamics of the time, limited communication, fragmented reporting, and reliance on community policing, played a significant role in enabling his actions. By 1934, Fish's activities had drawn significant attention from law enforcement. Investigators began connecting cases that had previously seemed isolated, identifying commonalities in victim profiles and geographic patterns. Detectives employed stakeouts, interviews with families, and surveillance of neighborhoods where children had gone missing. Fish's eventual apprehension would rely on a combination of these investigative techniques, as well as the cooperation of vigilant citizens who reported suspicious behavior. These efforts demonstrate the evolution of investigative methods in response to complex criminal behavior, illustrating how early patterns of offending can eventually provide the data needed for law enforcement intervention. The escalation of Fish's offenses also had profound effects on the families and communities he targeted. While historians and psychologists focus on patterns and pathology, the human impact remains central. Parents lived in fear, children were at risk, and neighborhoods experienced heightened anxiety. This context underscores the dual responsibility of law enforcement and social services to protect vulnerable populations, a challenge made more difficult in Fish's era due to limited resources and understanding of severe mental illness. The ripple effects of his actions, both psychological and societal, highlight the broader consequences of unchecked criminal behavior. Psychiatrists examining Fish later noted that during this phase of his life, he exhibited classic symptoms of severe psychosis, combined with paraphilic compulsions. He reportedly experienced hallucinations, intrusive fantasies, and extreme guilt juxtaposed with rationalizations that reinforced his behavior. These features make his case a key subject in studies of abnormal psychology, illustrating how mental illness, compulsion, and opportunity intersect to produce extreme criminal acts. His early offenses provide insight not only into his individual pathology but also into the broader challenges of identifying and managing high-risk individuals in society. As his criminal pattern became clearer, Fish also demonstrated a troubling degree of meticulous documentation. Diaries, letters, and other writings from this period reveal the extent of his premeditation, the depth of his fantasies, and the organized nature of his compulsions. Researchers and law enforcement analysts have cited these documents as crucial evidence, offering a window into the mind of an individual whose outward normalcy masked profound pathology. The records serve as a reminder that extreme criminal behavior often exists beneath a surface that appears ordinary, making early recognition and intervention essential. Fish's early 1930s offenses culminated in acts that would eventually draw the attention of the wider public and law enforcement, setting the stage for his eventual capture. These years demonstrate a clear progression, from private compulsions to minor transgressions, to increasingly serious offenses, and finally to the high-profile acts that would define his historical legacy. Understanding this progression allows scholars to examine not only Fish's individual pathology, but also the societal and systemic factors that allowed him to act for so long without detection. During this period, Fish's case also highlighted the limitations of contemporary mental health services. Though he exhibited clear signs of severe psychiatric disturbance, there were no effective interventions available. Social stigma, limited psychiatric understanding, and the absence of structured preventive programs allowed his behavior to escalate unchecked. Modern analyses often emphasize the lessons that can be drawn from this historical context: the importance of early identification, mental health treatment, and community vigilance in preventing harm from individuals. By the mid-1930s, Albert Fish had continued his pattern of disturbing behavior for decades, yet the full scope of his activities remained hidden from public view. It was during this period that the consequences of his escalating compulsions began intersecting more directly with law enforcement and the wider community. The crimes he committed were becoming increasingly visible, and a combination of investigative diligence, public awareness, and sheer circumstance would eventually converge to bring him to justice. Understanding this phase of his life is crucial to appreciating both the methodical nature of his offenses and the social and legal context that allowed them to continue undetected for so long. Fish's continued targeting of vulnerable children created patterns that eventually became discernible to both families and authorities. Parents reported missing children, often noting the circumstances in which they disappeared, times and locations that suggested premeditation. Local newspapers began documenting these cases, emphasizing the mysterious and alarming nature of these disappearances. While Fish himself remained outwardly ordinary, these accumulating reports provided the first real indication that a systematic offender might be at work. Authorities, constrained by limited forensic technology and investigative experience with crimes of this nature, relied heavily on community vigilance and anecdotal evidence. One of the defining aspects of this period was Fish's ability to continue acting without immediate consequence. He carefully selected victims who were isolated or otherwise vulnerable, often using deception to lure them. His outward persona, an elderly man who appeared harmless and unremarkable, helped him avoid suspicion. Fish would sometimes approach families, neighbors, or acquaintances under innocuous pretenses, reinforcing the appearance of normalcy. This capacity for concealment, combined with the rudimentary investigative tools of the time, allowed him to maintain a disturbing dual life: an ordinary member of society by day, a predator in secret. The investigative context of Fish's capture illustrates both the limitations and ingenuity of law enforcement in the early 20th century. Detectives relied on careful observation, interviews, and the painstaking compilation of reports from multiple communities. Clues came from disparate sources: witness accounts, letters, and physical evidence, none of which could independently secure a conviction, but together formed a picture of a dangerous individual operating in secrecy. The process was slow, requiring patience, persistence, and the ability to connect seemingly unrelated incidents. The investigation ultimately depended on a combination of methodical police work and the vigilance of ordinary citizens who noticed anomalies in their neighborhoods. A turning point in the investigation came when Fish sent a letter to the family of one of his victims. This correspondence, which arrived under the guise of a benign communication, contained information that directly implicated him in the child's disappearance and death. The letter itself was bizarre and horrifying, reflecting Fish's deep psychological disturbances, but it also provided law enforcement with the concrete evidence necessary to pursue him more aggressively. Analysis of the letter, combined with other investigative leads, enabled authorities to narrow their focus and take steps toward apprehension. The letter, in retrospect, demonstrates the tension between Fish's compulsions and his operational caution. He was driven to communicate with the victim's family, yet this act directly facilitated his identification. During this phase, investigators also examined Fish's previous residences and employment history. Patterns emerged linking him to multiple incidents over several decades, revealing a broader scope of criminal activity than had previously been documented. Interviews with neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances provided additional insight into his behavior, character, and routines. Collectively, these pieces of evidence painted a portrait of a man whose compulsions were deeply ingrained, highly organized, and increasingly dangerous. The challenge for law enforcement was to synthesize this information into a coherent case that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. The social context of the time played a significant role in both Fish's ability to operate undetected and the eventual success of the investigation. In the 1930s, communication between police departments and across city boundaries was limited. Records were maintained manually, and the concept of profiling or psychological assessment was in its infancy. Families were often left to manage their fears and suspicions independently, while law enforcement worked within the constraints of existing protocols. Fish's apparent normalcy, combined with the fragmented nature of information, allowed him to continue his predatory behavior for years, demonstrating how systemic limitations can inadvertently enable extreme criminal conduct. As investigators closed in, Fish's psychological profile became increasingly important. Experts reviewing the case noted his combination of obsessive compulsions, paraphilic disorders, and delusional thinking. His letters and other writings revealed both a meticulous approach to planning his offenses and a complete disregard for the moral and legal consequences of his actions. Psychologists have later emphasized that this combination of traits made him exceptionally dangerous. He was able to rationalize extreme acts, plan them carefully, and maintain outward normalcy, all while acting on compulsions that escalated over decades. This phase of his life underscores the importance of understanding the interplay between mental illness, compulsion, and opportunity in preventing and investigating extreme criminal behavior. The arrest of Fish in 1934 followed careful surveillance and corroboration of evidence collected from multiple sources. Law enforcement officers traced a letter to him, confirming his identity through handwriting analysis and personal records. Neighbors and acquaintances corroborated his presence in the relevant areas during the periods when crimes occurred. This painstaking process of linking Fish to multiple offenses highlights the critical role of methodical investigation, public reporting, and attention to detail in apprehending offenders who otherwise blend seamlessly into ordinary society. Fish's apprehension also brought to light the horrifying extent of his activities. While law enforcement at the time chose to publicize certain elements with discretion to protect the dignity of victims and families, the full scope of his crimes was gradually revealed during interrogation and trial proceedings. These findings shocked the public, not only because of the brutality of his actions but also because of the decades-long pattern of undetected offenses. The case prompted widespread discussion about both individual pathology and societal responsibility, emphasizing the need for vigilance, effective mental health services, and improved coordination among law enforcement agencies. The psychological and legal processes that followed Fish's arrest were complex. Investigators and psychologists worked together to understand his motivations, mental state, and methods. Fish's admissions, writings, and interviews provided crucial insights into his compulsions, the premeditated nature of his acts, and the psychological mechanisms that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Experts later emphasized that his case illustrates the intersection of severe mental illness, early trauma, and opportunity, highlighting the importance of systemic interventions in preventing similar tragedies. During his incarceration, Fish underwent extensive evaluation. Psychologists documented his mental disorders, noting obsessive and paraphilic behaviors, delusions related to religious beliefs, and a lack of conventional empathy. These assessments played a significant role in shaping the legal proceedings, influencing both the charges brought against him and the considerations regarding his mental fitness for trial. Scholars examining the case today often reference these evaluations as foundational in understanding how extreme criminal behavior can develop and persist over decades. Fish's arrest marked a critical turning point not only in his own life but also in American criminal history. The case demonstrated the limitations of early 20th century investigative techniques, the societal gaps that allowed predatory behavior to go unnoticed, and the evolving understanding of severe mental illness in the context of violent crime. His apprehension brought relief to communities that had lived in fear for years and provided a rare opportunity for law enforcement to prevent further harm from an extraordinarily dangerous individual. The period following Fish's capture also illuminated the profound psychological impact on victims' families and communities. While the public was understandably horrified, law enforcement made efforts to shield families from sensationalized coverage and to treat the case with discretion. This phase underscores the dual responsibility of legal authorities. to bring offenders to justice while minimizing additional trauma to those already affected. The balance between transparency and sensitivity remains a critical consideration in criminal investigations today. The investigation into Fish's crimes, culminating in his arrest, exemplifies the slow and methodical process often necessary to apprehend a complex offender. It also highlights how patterns of behavior, once recognized, can provide the evidence needed to intervene effectively. Fish's case remains a textbook example in criminal psychology and law enforcement. Following Albert Fish's arrest, the attention of both law enforcement and the public turned toward understanding the full scope of his actions and preparing for his trial. Fish's apprehension was the culmination of years of compulsive criminal behavior intersecting with meticulous police work, and the legal proceedings that followed revealed the chilling depths of his pathology. This phase of his life represents a critical period in American criminal history, where the intersections of mental illness, legal accountability, and public fascination converged in a high-profile case that would endure in both legal and cultural memory. From the outset, the authorities understood that Fish's trial would be complex. The nature of his crimes, involving children and extreme psychological disturbances, demanded careful handling to ensure justice while protecting the dignity of victims and their families. Fish himself exhibited behavior that was at times confounding and disturbing during initial interrogations. He was willing to discuss aspects of his past actions, often in detached or matter-of-fact terms, which further underscored the severity of his mental disorders. Law enforcement and legal experts recognized that they were dealing with a man whose pathology was deeply entrenched and whose compulsions had persisted unchecked for decades. Early psychological evaluations played a central role in the proceedings. Psychiatric experts sought to determine Fish's mental state at the time of his offenses, examining whether he was legally competent to stand trial and how his psychological condition might affect his culpability. Reports described a combination of obsessive-compulsive tendencies, paraphilic disorders, and delusional thinking that had driven his behavior. Fish's writings, letters, and prior confessions were analyzed extensively to construct a profile that could guide both the prosecution and defense. These evaluations revealed the extraordinary nature of his compulsions, illustrating a profound disconnection between his actions and conventional moral reasoning. The trial preparations also involved extensive work to ensure the safety and well-being of witnesses and the victims' families. Attorneys, law enforcement, and court officials coordinated to present evidence in a manner that minimized additional trauma while accurately conveying the gravity of Fish's actions. This required a careful balance between transparency and sensitivity. Families were given the opportunity to participate, share testimony, and prepare for the public scrutiny that inevitably accompanied a case of this magnitude. The trial itself would be both a legal and psychological examination of an individual whose criminal behavior had long defied conventional understanding. Fish's legal representation faced the challenge of presenting a defense that took into account his documented mental illness while addressing the severity of the offenses. The defense argued that Fish's mental state rendered him incapable of fully understanding the nature of his actions or controlling his compulsions. Psychiatric testimony detailed his psychosis, religious delusions, and obsessive behaviors, providing context for his criminal acts. The prosecution, on the other hand, emphasized the premeditated and calculated aspects of Fish's actions, underscoring that he had repeatedly engaged in highly organized criminal behavior over decades. This tension between mental illness and legal responsibility would become a central focus of the trial. The courtroom proceedings were marked by a combination of public fascination and solemnity. The press covered the case extensively, reflecting society's enduring interest in extreme criminal behavior, yet the court made efforts to maintain a respectful and orderly environment. Fish's demeanor during the trial was notable. He remained composed and cooperative, at times discussing his actions with unsettling calmness. His ability to articulate details of his offenses while showing little apparent emotion raised questions about his understanding of morality, guilt, and social norms, contributing to the psychological profile developed by experts. Evidence presented in court was extensive, including correspondence, diary entries, and corroborated accounts from previous investigations. These materials illustrated the systematic nature of Fish's offenses and provided critical context for understanding both the scope of his criminal behavior and the psychological mechanisms driving it. Experts testified regarding his compulsions, the premeditation evident in his actions, and the ways in which his mental disorders facilitated prolonged criminal activity. The trial thus served not only as a legal proceeding but also as a public demonstration of the complexity of severe criminal pathology. Throughout the trial, the question of mental competence remained central. Fish's defense sought to argue that his delusions and compulsions prevented him from fully comprehending the criminality of his actions. Psychiatric evaluations highlighted his intense religious preoccupations, obsessive rituals, and deeply ingrained paraphilic urges. However, the prosecution countered by emphasizing Fish's meticulous planning, the repeated nature of his offenses, and his ability to conceal his behavior from authorities and the public. The court had to weigh these competing perspectives carefully, considering both the legal standards of the time and the broader implications of a verdict influenced by psychiatric testimony. Public reaction to the trial was intense and multifaceted. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and community discussions reflected a mixture of shock, horror, and curiosity. While many were appalled by the details of Fish's offenses, others were drawn to the psychological aspects of the case, seeking to understand how a man could commit such acts and remain undetected for so long. The trial became a focal point for discussions about mental illness, criminal justice, and the social responsibilities of communities and law enforcement agencies. Fish's case highlighted the interplay between individual pathology and societal systems, demonstrating how extreme criminal behavior can both evade and challenge conventional legal frameworks. During the proceedings, attention was also given to Fish's life history. Experts and witnesses described his early experiences, including childhood trauma, familial instability, and early signs of deviant behavior. These factors were presented not to excuse his actions but to provide context for understanding the development of his compulsions. The integration of biographical detail with psychological assessment offered the court and public a more nuanced perspective, illustrating that extreme criminal behavior often arises from a combination of personal history, mental disorder, and environmental opportunity. Fish's interactions with the legal system were further complicated by his tendency towards self-incrimination and confession. He provided detailed accounts of past offenses, some of which had not yet been connected to him by investigators. These confessions were carefully examined, corroborated where possible, and presented in court to establish a clear record of his criminal history. The process of validating these confessions required meticulous cross-referencing with historical records, witness testimony, and investigative findings, highlighting the painstaking nature of legal and forensic work in cases involving long-term and hidden patterns of criminal activity. The trial also provided insight into contemporary attitudes toward mental illness in criminal proceedings. While modern standards might approach cases like Fish's with a broader understanding of psychological disorders, the 1930s legal framework required careful balancing between psychiatric testimony and the expectation of personal responsibility. Fish's case became a reference point for discussions about the intersection of mental illness, criminal behavior, and the capacity for legal accountability. The courtroom debates, expert analyses, and public discourse contributed to a developing understanding of how justice systems could address crimes committed by individuals with severe psychological disturbances. As the trial progressed, it became evident that Fish's case was about more than legal guilt. It was about understanding the nature of human behavior at its most extreme. Psychologists, legal experts, and the media scrutinized his actions, writings, and personality, seeking to answer questions about compulsion, morality, and responsibility. Fish's ability to articulate his experiences and provide insight into his thought processes offered a unique, though unsettling, window into the mind of an individual whose criminal behavior defied conventional explanation. By the conclusion of the trial, the combination of detailed evidence, expert testimony, and Fish's own admissions established a compelling case for conviction. The court's task was not only to hold him accountable for his actions but also to navigate the complex interplay between demonstrated mental illness and the legal requirements for criminal responsibility. Fish's case became a landmark in discussions about the treatment of psychologically disturbed offenders within the judicial system, influencing both contemporary and later considerations of law, psychiatry, and public safety. Throughout this phase of his life, the impact on the families of victims remained central. While Fish's trial revealed the depth of his pathology and the extent of his crimes, it also underscored the human cost of his actions. Families had endured years of fear, uncertainty, and grief, and the trial provided a measure of closure, even as it could not undo the harm caused. Their experiences remind us that behind every criminal. Following his trial, Albert Fish faced the final legal stages of his case. The court had carefully examined his actions, his mental state, and the evidence amassed over years of investigation. Fish's defense had highlighted his severe psychological disturbances, while the prosecution had emphasized the premeditated and repeated nature of his crimes. After weighing the testimony of psychiatrists, witnesses, and law enforcement officials, the jury reached a verdict that would have profound consequences not only for Fish himself but also for the families of his victims and the broader public grappling with the horror of his actions. The verdict found Fish guilty of multiple counts of murder, and the sentence was death. The decision reflected both the severity of his offenses and the limitations of the law in addressing the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility at the time. While Fish's defense argued that he was not fully accountable due to his psychological disorders, the court determined that the deliberate planning and execution of his crimes demonstrated sufficient awareness and intent. This legal outcome would become a defining aspect of Fish's legacy, as it exemplified the challenges of balancing justice with the recognition of severe mental illness. Following sentencing, Fish was transferred to a correctional facility equipped to handle high-security prisoners. During his incarceration, he underwent further psychiatric evaluations, which provided additional insight into his mental state. Psychologists documented his obsessive behaviors, religious delusions, and deeply ingrained compulsions, emphasizing that his criminal actions were closely linked to these psychological conditions. These evaluations became critical for historical and academic analysis, offering future generations a detailed understanding of how extreme pathology can manifest over a lifetime. Fish's life in prison was marked by isolation, reflection, and continued documentation of his thoughts and experiences. He maintained a correspondence with certain individuals, including clergy and legal representatives, through which he occasionally discussed his past actions, beliefs, and personal reflections. These writings revealed a man who was at once self-aware of the gravity of his crimes, and yet deeply immersed in the compulsions that had driven them. Researchers and historians later used these materials to understand not only the chronology of his offenses but also the psychological mechanisms that underpinned them. During this period, attention also turned to the impact of Fish's conviction and sentencing on the public consciousness. Newspapers, radio reports, and community discussions documented a society grappling with the enormity of his crimes and the implications for justice and mental health systems. Fish's case became a reference point for debates about the death penalty, the treatment of mentally ill offenders, and the responsibilities of social institutions to protect vulnerable populations. The extensive media coverage, while respectful of victims' families in many instances, reflected the public's deep fascination with understanding how such an individual could operate undetected for so long. In prison, Fish's behavior remained largely compliant, though marked by the patterns of compulsion that had defined his earlier life. He engaged in routine activities under strict supervision, and his interactions with guards and staff were carefully monitored. Reports indicate that Fish occasionally displayed unusual or ritualistic behaviors consistent with his documented psychological disorders. While incarcerated, he was under the watchful eye of both correctional authorities and mental health professionals, ensuring that his interactions were controlled and that he did not pose a danger to others. These measures reflect an evolving understanding of how to manage prisoners with severe psychological disturbances, balancing safety with the need for observation and study. Fish's mental health continued to be a subject of study and discussion among psychologists and criminologists. Researchers examined the interplay between his childhood trauma, paraphilic disorders, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors, seeking to understand how these factors contributed to a life of repeated criminality. Analyses of his writings, confessions, and observed behaviors highlighted a pattern of escalating compulsions combined with an extraordinary ability to conceal his actions. This period in his life, therefore, became essential for developing theories about the prevention, identification, and management of extreme criminal behavior. While Fish remained imprisoned, his case continued to influence public discourse and legal considerations. Scholars, legal professionals, and mental health experts used the ongoing documentation of his behavior to inform policy and practice, particularly in the areas of forensic psychology and criminal justice. The detailed records kept by correctional staff, combined with Fish's own writings, provided a rare opportunity to study the mind of an individual who had committed some of the most notorious crimes of his era. These studies contributed to a growing understanding of how mental illness can intersect with criminal behavior, and how institutions can respond more effectively to prevent further harm. Despite the grim nature of his crimes, Fish's incarceration also highlighted broader societal questions about rehabilitation, punishment, and the treatment of mentally ill offenders. His case demonstrated that certain individuals, due to the severity of their psychological disorders, may pose a persistent risk that requires lifelong supervision. At the same time, his documented mental illness challenged simplistic notions of morality and responsibility, emphasizing the need for nuanced legal and psychological frameworks. Fish's life in prison thus served as both a cautionary tale and an educational resource, illustrating the complexities involved in managing extreme criminal behavior. The ethical considerations surrounding Fish's imprisonment and eventual execution were topics of discussion among scholars, journalists, and legal professionals. Debates centered on whether the death penalty was appropriate for someone with such severe psychological disturbances, or whether his mental illness should have altered the course of his sentence. These conversations underscored the tension between societal demands for justice and the recognition of the mitigating influence of mental illness. Fish's case became a touchstone for discussions about capital punishment, mental health law, and the responsibilities of the justice system in addressing offenders with profound psychological pathology. Throughout his incarceration, Fish occasionally reflected on his past and the impact of his actions. Interviews and writings suggest a mixture of self-awareness and delusional rationalization, revealing a complex interplay between guilt, compulsion, and psychological disorder. While it is impossible to fully comprehend his internal experiences, these documents provide crucial insight into the thought processes of someone whose actions had caused immeasurable harm. Mental health professionals and historians later used these reflections to better understand the development of extreme criminal behavior and the challenges of addressing it within both legal and therapeutic contexts. As the years progressed, the inevitability of Fish's execution loomed. The legal process, including appeals and reviews of his mental state, ensured that the sentence would withstand judicial scrutiny. Fish's case required careful adherence to due process, reflecting the broader principles of justice that govern even the most notorious offenders. The preparation for his execution included psychological assessments, administrative planning, and legal verification, ensuring that the sentence was carried out according to the standards of the time. In these final years before his execution, Fish's life was marked by routine, observation, and reflection. He remained in controlled custody, studied by professionals interested in both the psychological and legal dimensions of his case. The combination of his documented behavior, psychiatric evaluations, and personal writings created a comprehensive record of a man whose life had been defined by both extraordinary pathology and the eventual mechanisms of societal accountability. The story of Albert Fish during his incarceration illustrates the intersection of criminal justice, psychology, and social ethics. His life behind bars was not simply a period of punishment. It was also a time of observation, reflection, and documentation that contributed to the understanding of extreme criminal behavior. By studying Fish, law enforcement, psychologists, and the public gained a more nuanced understanding of how severe psychological disorders can influence criminal conduct, and how society can respond to prevent and manage such behavior in the future. This period also underscores the human cost of extreme criminal acts, not only to victims and their families but also to society as a whole. Fish's crimes prompted changes in investigative techniques, legal approaches, and the study of forensic psychology, leaving a legacy that extends beyond the immediate horror of his offenses. His life in prison demonstrates both the consequences of unchecked compulsions and the role of societal institutions in eventually containing and addressing extreme criminal behavior. By the time Fish approached the end of his life, the decades of investigation, trial, and incarceration had produced a full record of his actions, his psychological profile, and the societal response to his crimes. This record continues to serve as a resource for understanding. As Albert Fish approached the end of his life, the focus of attention shifted from the years of crime and incarceration to the final chapter of his existence, the execution that would mark the culmination of decades of horrific actions. His last years in prison were shaped by a mixture of routine confinement, ongoing psychological evaluation, and growing public attention, reflecting both the gravity of his crimes and the societal imperative to ensure justice was carried out appropriately. During this period, the boundaries between punishment, reflection, and historical documentation became increasingly clear. Within the prison system, Fish was maintained under high security conditions. Correctional staff monitored him closely, balancing the need for order and safety with the legal requirements of humane treatment. He followed the structured daily routines typical of inmates on death row, including regulated periods of recreation, meals, and limited interaction with other prisoners. Observers noted that while he remained calm and cooperative, the obsessive and ritualistic aspects of his personality persisted, consistent with the behaviors documented throughout his life. These patterns were not simply curiosities. They provided critical insight for psychologists and criminologists studying the connections between compulsive behaviors, mental illness, and criminality. As the date of his execution approached, preparations became more intense and precise. Legal authorities verified that all appeals and procedural requirements had been completed, ensuring that the sentence could be carried out in accordance with the law. Psychologists and prison officials also examined Fish's mental state to confirm that he was competent and aware of the consequences of the sentence. These steps reflected the seriousness with which the justice system treated the execution process, balancing the public demand for accountability with the ethical responsibilities inherent in capital punishment. Fish's behavior during this time remained composed, although interviews and correspondence indicate moments of reflection and sometimes unsettling rationalizations. He occasionally wrote letters or spoke to prison staff about his past, providing candid, if disturbing, insights into his thought processes. These reflections revealed a man who understood, in broad terms, the legal and social consequences of his actions, but whose compulsions and psychological disturbances had shaped a life that left little room for conventional moral reasoning. For historians and psychologists, these insights were invaluable, offering a rare window into the mind of someone whose crimes had long puzzled both law enforcement and the public. Public interest in Fish's execution was intense. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and later historical accounts documented the anticipation surrounding the event, highlighting society's complex relationship with infamous criminals. The case had become emblematic of extreme criminal pathology, and the attention paid to his final days reflected both fascination and revulsion. Families of his victims, while still coping with the profound losses they had suffered, often followed the proceedings closely, seeking some measure of closure in the resolution of the legal process. Their experiences underscore the enduring human cost of crime, even decades after the offenses were committed. Fish's execution was carried out according to the legal standards of the time, which involved careful planning and adherence to procedural requirements. In the moments leading up to the execution, he was offered spiritual guidance and the opportunity to make final statements, as mandated by law. These final interactions were conducted with the intent of preserving dignity within the limits of a process designed to deliver justice for extraordinarily grave crimes. Observers described Fish's comportment as consistent with his long history of cooperation, though the severity of his crimes cast a long shadow over the event. The execution itself marked the legal conclusion of Fish's life of crime, but it did not end the societal examination of his actions. Scholars, journalists, and psychologists continued to analyze the case, seeking to understand the factors that had contributed to his compulsions and criminal behavior. Fish's life became a case study in extreme pathology, illustrating how early trauma, mental illness, and deviant compulsions can intersect with opportunity and social conditions to produce devastating outcomes. These lessons remain relevant for modern criminal justice systems, mental health care providers, and social services, highlighting the importance of early intervention and comprehensive support for at-risk individuals. In the immediate aftermath of Fish's execution, attention turned to reflection and documentation. Researchers compiled records of his life, crimes, and incarceration, ensuring that future generations could study the complex interplay between pathology and criminality. The detailed accounts of his behavior, both inside and outside prison, provided a comprehensive understanding of how his compulsions had evolved and the ways in which societal systems had attempted, with varying degrees of success, to intervene. These analyses informed later discussions of forensic psychology, criminal profiling, and the management of high-risk offenders with severe mental disorders. Fish's death also sparked broader ethical and philosophical debates. His case prompted society to confront difficult questions about accountability, justice, and the treatment of mentally ill offenders. Could someone whose life had been shaped by profound psychological disturbance be fully responsible for their actions? How should society balance the need for public safety with compassion and understanding for individuals with severe mental illness? These debates continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about criminal justice, the death penalty, and mental health policy, reflecting the enduring significance of Fish's life and crimes. For the families of his victims, Fish's execution provided a sense of closure, though it could not erase the trauma and loss they had endured. Their experiences highlight the long-lasting human consequences of crime and the importance of justice systems that not only punish offenders but also recognize and support the needs of victims. Fish's case serves as a reminder that criminal acts leave indelible marks on communities, families, and individuals, and that accountability, while necessary, exists alongside the need for empathy and understanding. Historians and psychologists have since analyzed Fish's life to explore patterns of compulsive criminal behavior, paraphilic disorders, and the long-term impact of childhood trauma. His case illustrates the importance of early intervention, thorough psychological assessment, and coordinated social support systems. While his actions were extraordinary in their severity, they are instructive for understanding how extreme pathology can manifest and the ways in which society can respond to prevent similar tragedies. Albert Fish's execution also left a lasting impression on the field of criminal justice. His case became a reference point for discussions of competency, insanity defenses, and the ethical responsibilities of courts in handling defendants with severe mental illness. Legal scholars continue to examine Fish's trial and execution as a critical example of how the justice system navigates the challenges of extreme pathology while upholding societal expectations for accountability. These lessons remain relevant today, informing policies and procedures for handling complex criminal cases. In retrospect, Fish's life and death illustrate the complex interplay between mental illness, criminal behavior, and societal response. His compulsions, formed and exacerbated by early trauma and unaddressed psychological disorders, led to a series of crimes that shocked the nation. His incarceration, trial, and eventual execution highlight the mechanisms through which society seeks to balance justice, safety, and ethical responsibility. Fish's life, while deeply tragic and disturbing, continues to offer lessons for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and policymakers in understanding and managing extreme criminal behavior. The historical documentation of Fish's life after arrest, during incarceration, and leading to his execution has allowed researchers to piece together a comprehensive understanding of his psychological profile. This documentation underscores the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration among law enforcement, legal experts, and mental health professionals. By studying the trajectory of Fish's life, society gains insight into both the failures and successes of systems designed to detect, prevent, and respond to severe criminal behavior. These insights inform current practices and highlight the ongoing need for vigilance, research, and education in the fields of criminology and psychology. Albert Fish's final years, culminating in his execution, represent a sobering reminder of the consequences of unchecked compulsions, untreated mental illness, and systemic failures. The processes that led to his sentencing and ultimate execution reflect the challenges inherent in balancing justice, accountability, and ethical considerations in the treatment of offenders with extreme psychological disturbances. By examining Fish's life from this perspective, one gains a deeper understanding of both the human capacity for deviance and the societal mechanisms designed to contain it. In sum, the final phase of Albert Fish's life, his incarceration, psychological evaluation, and eventual even after Albert Fish's death, his story continued to capture the attention of society, scholars, and the general public. His life, crimes, and execution became a case study for understanding extreme criminal behavior, mental illness, and the societal and legal responses to such acts. The fascination with Fish is complex, driven not only by the horrific nature of his crimes but also by the psychological and sociological questions his life raises. Scholars and writers sought to examine what circumstances, experiences, and disorders had contributed to his path, and how these insights could inform both criminal justice and mental health practices. In the years following his execution, Fish's case was analyzed in books, journals, and documentaries. Researchers focused on his psychological profile, often exploring the interplay between childhood trauma, compulsive behaviors, and paraphilic disorders. His early life experiences, marked by abuse, neglect, and exposure to a chaotic environment, provided crucial context for understanding how extreme psychological patterns could develop. Psychologists used his case to highlight warning signs of dangerous behavior, emphasizing the need for early intervention and monitoring in situations where mental health and social support systems are inadequate. Media portrayals, both documentary and dramatized, further cemented Fish's place in public consciousness. Authors and filmmakers approached his story with varying degrees of sensitivity and focus. Some works concentrated on the psychological and criminological aspects, seeking to educate and inform about the nature of extreme pathology. Others, while attempting to remain factual, inevitably sparked public fascination due to the shocking elements of his crimes. These portrayals provoked discussions about ethical storytelling, the balance between truth and sensationalism, and the responsibilities of media when covering cases involving heinous acts. Scholars have repeatedly emphasized the importance of respecting victims in recounting Fish's story. While the details of his crimes draw attention, ethical analysis requires focusing on systemic understanding and prevention rather than lurid fascination. In this respect, Fish's case became a benchmark for evaluating how society addresses high-profile criminal acts while maintaining sensitivity toward the human cost of such events. Discussions surrounding the victim's experiences and the societal response underscore the human impact beyond the individual offender, reminding audiences that every criminal act has lasting consequences for families and communities. Albert Fish's life has also been used to explore legal and ethical issues surrounding mental illness and the justice system. His documented psychological disorders raised questions about the extent to which individuals can be held fully accountable for actions driven by compulsions and delusions. The legal proceedings, which concluded in a death sentence, became a reference point for discussions about competency, criminal responsibility, and the role of mental health evaluations in capital cases. Scholars continue to debate the nuances of his trial, considering both the need for justice and the ethical challenges of sentencing a mentally disturbed individual to death. The academic interest in Fish's case spans multiple disciplines. Criminologists analyze patterns of escalation, targeting, and concealment to understand how offenders with severe compulsions plan and execute their crimes. Psychologists study his behavior and writings to explore the manifestation of obsessive thoughts and paraphilic disorders. Sociologists examine the societal conditions, family structures, and institutional failures that may contribute to the development of extreme criminal behavior. In combination, these analyses provide a multifaceted understanding of Fish, demonstrating how individual pathology intersects with environmental factors to produce tragic outcomes. In addition to academic studies, Fish's story influenced forensic practices and criminal profiling. Law enforcement agencies, both historically and in subsequent decades, used his case as an example of the importance of meticulous evidence collection, careful analysis of patterns, and understanding offender psychology. Techniques developed to investigate, apprehend, and prosecute offenders like Fish contributed to the evolution of investigative procedures, ultimately improving public safety and the effectiveness of criminal justice responses. His case served as a cautionary tale, highlighting the importance of early recognition, cross-jurisdictional collaboration, and the need to understand both the psychological and behavioral tendencies of high-risk offenders. Fish's posthumous legacy also includes reflections on societal attitudes toward mental illness and criminality. His life exposed the consequences of neglecting psychological care and the dangers posed when compulsions and deviant behaviors go unaddressed. Discussions about Fish in the decades following his death often focus on how society can better identify and intervene in cases where extreme behaviors emerge. By examining his trajectory, policymakers, mental health professionals, and legal authorities gained insight into potential preventive measures, ranging from social services support to targeted mental health interventions. Culturally, Fish became an enduring figure in discussions about the intersection of crime and psychology. While public fascination often veered toward the sensational, many works emphasized the broader lessons his life offered. Documentaries and scholarly analyses sought to explore not only what he did but why, contextualizing his actions within a framework of childhood trauma, compulsive pathology, and societal failure. These approaches underscored that understanding extreme offenders requires more than cataloging crimes. It demands a careful examination of the conditions, experiences, and vulnerabilities that shaped their behavior. Ethical debates surrounding Fish also focused on the media's role in amplifying notoriety. His case demonstrated how coverage of extreme criminal acts could shift from informative reporting to sensational storytelling, potentially influencing public perception and complicating discussions of accountability and justice. Scholars and journalists reflected on how best to communicate such cases responsibly, balancing the public's need for information with respect for victims and awareness of the psychological implications of reporting. These conversations contributed to evolving standards in both journalism and documentary filmmaking when addressing notorious crimes. Despite the grim fascination with his life, Fish's story also serves as a reminder of the human consequences of extreme pathology. Each criminal act represented trauma for the victims and families affected, and the societal response to such cases reflects both the imperative for justice and the ongoing effort to understand and prevent future tragedies. Fish's life has become a case study in the importance of early intervention, comprehensive social support, and the integration of mental health expertise into criminal justice systems. Over time, Fish's case became central to discussions in academic and professional circles about the balance between punishment, treatment, and ethical responsibility. His actions highlighted the complexity of human behavior, demonstrating that some criminal acts are deeply entwined with psychological disorders that complicate conventional notions of intent and accountability. By studying Fish, criminologists and mental health professionals were able to refine theories of extreme criminal behavior, offering insights into the identification and management of individuals with severe psychological disturbances. Finally, Fish's legacy is preserved in both historical records and contemporary discourse. His life, crimes, and the legal and psychological responses to them continue to inform ongoing discussions about criminal justice, mental health, and societal responsibility. While his actions remain shocking and tragic, the careful analysis of his life contributes to a broader understanding of the factors that can lead to extreme criminal behavior, emphasizing the importance of prevention, awareness, and ethical consideration in both law enforcement and mental health practice. Through decades of study, reflection, and documentation, Albert Fish's story has remained a cautionary tale, one that informs law enforcement, psychology, criminology, and society as a whole. His life, while horrifying in its actions, provides critical lessons about the intersections of childhood trauma, psychological disorder, and systemic oversight. In understanding Fish, society gains both a deeper comprehension of extreme criminality and a framework for preventing similar tragedies in the future. His legacy, though grim, has become a touchstone for research, discussion, and ethical reflection in multiple disciplines. The story of Albert Fish extends beyond his lifetime, continuing to influence the way criminal psychology, law enforcement, and society at large understand extreme behaviors and the impact of early trauma. While the details of his crimes are unsettling, the posthumous examination of his life provides a unique window into the intersection of mental illness, deviant behavior, and systemic responses. Scholars, psychologists, and criminologists have studied his life to extract lessons about detection, prevention, and societal responsibilities in cases involving individuals with severe pathology. Fish's legacy is, therefore, not only a cautionary tale of human cruelty but also a point of reflection on how society can mitigate such tragedies. From a psychological perspective, Fish's life is often analyzed through the lens of early childhood trauma and its long-term consequences. He experienced profound neglect and abuse in his formative years, including exposure to unstable environments, familial dysfunction, and early exposure to deviant behaviors. Experts argue that these experiences contributed to the development of compulsions and paraphilic disorders, compounding his predisposition toward harmful behavior. While these factors do not excuse his actions, they provide critical context for understanding the complex interplay of environment, psychology, and behavior. The study of such cases emphasizes the importance of early intervention, robust social services, and comprehensive mental health support for vulnerable populations. The field of criminal profiling also draws extensively on Fish's case. Law enforcement professionals examine his patterns of behavior, escalation, and choice of victims to understand warning signs in extreme offenders. Fish's meticulous attention to detail in concealing his actions, coupled with the compulsive nature of his crimes, demonstrates the challenges investigators face when attempting to detect and apprehend highly pathological individuals. His case highlights the necessity of collaboration among jurisdictions, as well as the integration of psychological insights into investigative processes, enabling law enforcement to identify, track, and intervene in cases of high-risk offenders more effectively. Beyond the academic and law enforcement contexts, Fish's life has been a catalyst for ethical reflection in both media and public discourse. His story raises fundamental questions about the balance between the public's right to information and the risk of sensationalizing extreme criminal acts. Documentaries, books, and scholarly articles have struggled to present his life accurately while avoiding exploitation of his notoriety. These discussions have influenced media standards for reporting on crime, emphasizing responsible storytelling that respects victims, contextualizes offenders' behavior, and provides educational insights rather than focusing solely on shock value. Fish's legacy also informs contemporary debates about the treatment of mentally ill offenders. His documented psychological disturbances, coupled with the severity of his actions, raise questions about the effectiveness of interventions and the ethical responsibilities of the legal system. Scholars argue that cases like Fish's underscore the importance of psychiatric evaluation, risk assessment, and targeted therapeutic approaches for individuals exhibiting extreme compulsions or pathological behavior. Moreover, his life demonstrates the challenges in distinguishing between criminal intent and actions driven by severe mental disorders, highlighting the necessity of nuanced legal and psychological frameworks. In examining Fish's influence on forensic psychology, it becomes clear that his case has contributed to the development of modern profiling techniques and risk assessment tools. By analyzing the motivations, methods, and psychological traits of extreme offenders, professionals are better equipped to predict potential behaviors, assess threats, and design preventive strategies. Fish's behaviors, while extreme, provide a unique dataset for understanding compulsive patterns, escalation, and the psychological mechanisms underlying violent actions. These insights have helped shape policies, procedures, and interventions aimed at reducing the risk posed by similar individuals in contemporary society. The societal reaction to Fish's story also provides valuable lessons. Public fascination with his crimes, while understandable, demonstrates the complex interplay between curiosity, fear, and ethical reflection. Communities, educators, and policymakers have used his case to foster discussions about crime prevention, mental health awareness, and the societal structures necessary to protect vulnerable individuals. His story reinforces the understanding that criminal behavior does not emerge in isolation but is influenced by broader environmental, psychological, and social factors, all of which require coordinated responses to mitigate risk. Legal scholars continue to study Fish's trial and execution as a critical example of the intersection between mental illness and capital punishment. Questions about competency, the insanity defense, and the ethical responsibilities of the legal system in cases of extreme pathology remain relevant. Fish's case highlights the challenge of balancing the need for justice, public safety, and ethical treatment for offenders with severe psychological disturbances. These discussions inform contemporary policy and practice, ensuring that modern legal frameworks are better equipped to handle complex cases while maintaining societal standards for fairness and accountability. Educational initiatives have also drawn upon Fish's life as a case study. Universities, law enforcement training programs, and psychology courses incorporate analyses of his behaviors to illustrate the consequences of untreated mental illness and extreme compulsive behaviors. By understanding the factors that contributed to his actions, students and professionals gain insight into prevention strategies, investigative techniques, and the ethical considerations inherent in managing high-risk individuals. Fish's case serves as a practical example, bridging theoretical knowledge with real-world implications for both mental health and criminal justice systems. Fish's story also prompts reflection on the importance of victim advocacy. While much attention understandably focuses on his psychology and pathology, ethical analysis insists on remembering the human cost of his actions. Families affected by his crimes endured long-term trauma, and acknowledging their experiences is essential for comprehensive understanding. Efforts to balance the study of Fish's behaviors with recognition of the victim's suffering provide a model for ethical research, media reporting, and policy development in cases involving violent offenders. Another enduring aspect of Fish's posthumous influence is the conversation about societal responsibility. His life demonstrates how systemic failures, whether in family support, mental health services, or early intervention programs, can contribute to the escalation of dangerous behaviors. Researchers and policymakers examine these gaps to develop strategies aimed at identifying and supporting at-risk individuals, ultimately seeking to prevent future tragedies. Fish's case, while extreme, exemplifies the broader societal imperative to address vulnerability, trauma, and mental health proactively rather than reactively. The legacy of Albert Fish also resonates in the cultural and historical context. His crimes, trial, and execution are frequently cited in discussions of 20th century criminal history, offering insight into both societal fears and the evolution of legal and psychological responses to extreme pathology. By analyzing his life and the responses it elicited, historians can trace changes in public perception, law enforcement practices, and media ethics over time. Fish's case functions as a lens through which broader societal trends and challenges related to crime, mental health, and justice can be examined. In contemporary discussions, Fish's life continues to inform debates about how to handle extreme criminal behavior ethically and effectively. Mental health professionals draw lessons about early identification of compulsive and dangerous tendencies, the importance of multidisciplinary intervention, and the consequences of failing to address severe pathology. Law enforcement agencies reflect on investigative lessons, while legal scholars examine frameworks for assessing competency and managing offenders with profound psychological disorders. Fish's life, though disturbing, has thus become a resource for improving systems designed to prevent and respond to serious crime. Ultimately, the enduring relevance of Fish's story lies in its capacity to inform, caution, and provoke reflection. By examining the circumstances of his upbringing, the progression of his behaviors, the systemic responses, and the societal impact of his crimes, professionals and the public gain a more nuanced understanding of the intersection between psychology, criminality, and justice. While the human cost of his actions cannot be understated, the lessons derived from his life contribute to more informed approaches in criminal justice, mental health care, and social policy. Albert Fish's posthumous impact underscores the delicate balance between fascination and ethical responsibility. His life remains a subject of study not for sensationalism, but to extract meaningful insights that can guide future interventions, policy development. Albert Fish's life and crimes have left an indelible mark on society, not merely for the horror of his actions but for the insights his story provides into human psychology, criminal behavior, and the social systems designed to prevent tragedy. While the details of his crimes remain shocking, the broader lessons drawn from his life underscore the complex interplay of mental illness, childhood trauma, and societal oversight. Understanding Fish is not an exercise in sensationalism, it is a study in the consequences of unaddressed pathology and the responsibilities of communities, families, and institutions in recognizing and intervening in dangerous behavior. From the very beginning, Fish's life was marked by instability. Born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., he experienced neglect, abuse, and early exposure to dysfunctional environments. Scholars examining his childhood highlight the lack of protective structures, a factor that many believe contributed to his compulsions and paraphilic disorders. His early experiences provide critical context. They illustrate how unaddressed trauma can manifest in behaviors that are both destructive to the self and harmful to others. Understanding this trajectory underscores the importance of early intervention in the lives of vulnerable children, a lesson as relevant today as it was a century ago. Throughout his adulthood, Fish exhibited behaviors that reflected both extreme compulsions and a deteriorating psychological state. Professionals studying his case note patterns of self-harm, obsessive behaviors, and escalating acts of deviance, all of which point to a profound disconnection from societal norms. While his crimes are often the focus of public attention, a comprehensive understanding of his life requires examining these underlying patterns. Psychologists argue that Fish exemplifies the consequences of compounded trauma, unaddressed mental illness, and the failure of social and medical systems to identify and intervene in cases of extreme risk. Fish's crimes, while abhorrent, provide valuable lessons in criminal profiling and forensic investigation. His methods were meticulous, demonstrating a high level of cunning and organization that challenged contemporary law enforcement. The investigation into his activities revealed the necessity of careful evidence collection, attention to behavioral patterns, and the integration of psychological insights into criminal investigations. Today, his case remains a teaching point in law enforcement training, illustrating both the challenges of apprehending offenders with severe compulsions and the strategies used to eventually bring such individuals to justice. Legal and ethical discussions surrounding Fish's trial and execution continue to resonate. His documented psychological disorders raised questions about criminal responsibility and competency, debates that are still relevant in contemporary jurisprudence. The legal system's handling of his case reflects the tension between ensuring justice for victims, maintaining public safety, and addressing the ethical implications of punishing individuals whose actions are influenced by severe mental disorders. Scholars often use his case to discuss the balance between accountability and compassion, highlighting the complex ethical terrain involved in extreme criminal cases. Fish's story also provides a lens through which to examine the societal response to deviant behavior. The public fascination with his crimes revealed both fear and curiosity, prompting reflection on how society consumes and reacts to stories of extreme criminality. While it is natural for such cases to draw attention, his life underscores the need for responsible discourse, acknowledging the victims, contextualizing the offender's behavior, and avoiding sensationalism that can obscure understanding. By framing discussions around prevention, mental health, and systemic responsibility, society can transform curiosity into constructive reflection and policy improvement. The psychological analysis of Fish's life has yielded insights into the intersection of trauma, compulsion, and deviant behavior. His documented paraphilic disorders and obsessive tendencies provide a case study in the escalation of psychological disturbances when untreated. mental health professionals study his case to understand how early interventions, therapy, and social support might have altered the trajectory of his life. In this sense, Fish's story serves as a stark reminder of the consequences when individuals with severe psychological vulnerabilities do not receive adequate care. Beyond psychology and law enforcement, Fish's legacy has influenced media, literature, and public consciousness. Writers, documentary filmmakers, and academics have explored his life not merely to recount horror but to illuminate broader questions about human behavior, societal responsibility, and the ethics of reporting on extreme crime. These portrayals highlight the tension between public interest and ethical storytelling, emphasizing the importance of respecting victims while providing accurate, nuanced context about offenders. In doing so, Fish's life has helped shape standards for ethical analysis and reporting in cases of extreme criminal behavior. An important aspect of Fish's posthumous impact is its role in education. His story is frequently included in criminology, psychology, and law enforcement curricula as a real-world example of how trauma, pathology, and social neglect can converge to produce destructive behavior. By studying his life, students and professionals gain insight into the warning signs, preventive strategies, and systemic interventions that can help mitigate the risk of similar outcomes. Fish's case illustrates the practical value of historical analysis in preparing contemporary systems to respond more effectively to individuals with extreme psychological disturbances. In considering the societal lessons of Fish's life, it becomes evident that his story extends beyond individual pathology. It is a reflection of systemic failures in family structure, in mental health services, and in community vigilance. His trajectory illustrates the need for comprehensive social safety nets that address early trauma, monitor at-risk individuals, and provide intervention when compulsive or dangerous behaviors emerge. Fish's life, while extreme, underscores that societal neglect can contribute to the escalation of behaviors that ultimately harm both the individual and the community. Ethically, discussions of Fish's legacy emphasize the importance of balancing understanding with accountability. While psychological and sociological analyses provide insight into why he behaved as he did, this understanding does not excuse the harm caused. Instead, it informs strategies for prevention, education, and intervention, highlighting the critical role of interdisciplinary approaches in addressing complex cases of extreme criminality. By integrating insights from psychology, law, social work, and public policy, society can better identify risk factors, support vulnerable individuals, and reduce the likelihood of future tragedies. Culturally, Fish remains a figure of enduring fascination, though contemporary discussion increasingly emphasizes responsible engagement with his story. Documentaries, books, and academic analyses explore his life to provide insight into human behavior, criminal investigation, and systemic challenges. They aim to move beyond shock value, offering a reflective lens through which to examine the intersections of trauma, mental illness, and societal responsibility. In this way, Fish's life serves as both a historical case study and a cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences of neglect, pathology, and failure to intervene effectively. Ultimately, the lasting significance of Albert Fish's story lies in its ability to educate and provoke reflection. His life offers crucial lessons for mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, legal scholars, educators, and the broader public. By studying his trajectory, society gains a deeper understanding of the warning signs of extreme behavior, the importance of early and effective intervention, and the ethical complexities of responding to individuals with profound psychological disturbances. Fish's case reminds us that while the actions of one individual can be horrifying, they also provide an opportunity to improve systems, prevent future tragedies, and understand the multifaceted nature of human behavior. In conclusion, Albert Fish's life and legacy are remembered not only for the crimes he committed but for the lessons his story imparts. The careful study of his childhood, pathology, criminal behavior, and the systemic responses to him provides enduring insights into the intersections of mental health, criminal justice, and societal responsibility. While his actions caused irreparable harm, the reflection, analysis, and discourse surrounding his life continue to inform practices aimed at preventing similar tragedies and fostering a more ethical, vigilant, and compassionate society. His story, though dark, serves as a critical resource for understanding the complexities of extreme human behavior and the societal obligations to intervene when warning signs emerge.